Hello, and welcome to the Dissidents podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society.
So welcome to this second part in our series with my co-host Winkfield Twyman Jr. and our guest, Brent Hamachek, on Dissidently Speaking. So if you listen to our first part of the series, we kind of ended up, and this is where I'd like to go now, y'all, on labels and the damage of labels, the futility of labels, and really actually maybe push back and see where a label may be necessary. So if you might recall, our last conversation ended with, I was reading a book, and I'm going to give more context now. I was reading a book on communism, which is something that I study with great interest. That is my background is China studies. And I was reading it and I believe, I mean, even the work that we're doing, both Brent, Wink and I, for this upcoming seminar summit that we're doing, a lot of it has to do with some of these ideological agendas that have gotten into the kind of the bloodstream of K through 12 education. So I'm very dedicated to this idea. And yet this one book, I feel like such an opportunity was missed because all he did was badmouth the other side. Instead of it being like a story of here's how these ideas are being infiltrated. It was not persuasive at all. He was talking to one audience and one audience only, and that was people who had already bought into his idea. I mean, if you did not, and here's someone who has actually bought into the idea, and I got through 45 minutes of it. I was listening to it. And one of the things that he kept on doing was he'd say, literally, like he'd write a paragraph and it would be like, and that is what they do. And that is what they do over and over again. So again, it was this us versus them, dialogue, and such an opportunity was missed to listen and to hear and to persuade. So anyways, fast forward, Wink, as in this book, I won't name it here, but Wink had actually been the first one to say, hey, what about this book?
Right. Yes.
Remember that?
I remember, yes.
This is before, Brent, you and I, we did our first podcast last week. And so Wink had asked me about it, and I said, it's a right-wing screed. And this is coming from someone who considers herself libertarian and more conservative as it is, right? So that's, to me, that's saying something. I'm actually calling out my own, if you will, And so Wink said to me, what would Brent say about that, right? Because I was labeling someone. And this is where we ended our conversation last time. I said, I was labeling someone, but he had already labeled himself as kind of right-wing, etc. And so we ended the conversation last time with Wink saying, but still, even if he labeled himself, did you let the lie come through you, to quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn? I think I said that right. I can never get Russian last names.
Good enough.
So, before we get on, and we don't have to discuss that in particular, but I really want to hear, Brent, in your book, one of the things that we talked about last week is, flipping the narrative from it is, making statements, to actually questioning, is it? But as part of that change in how we operate, how we communicate, you're saying we need to totally dismiss labels left, right. And we throw those around, myself clearly from the story, all the time without discrimination. Lead us forward, Brent. What do you think we can be doing better, and why? Is there ever a time that we could use those labels? That'd be appropriate.
If I might add a short addendum to that, you sent me recently, Jennifer, an essay that Helen Puckeres had put together about the recent disturbances, the recent troubles, if you will, in the UK, in England. And she had used the label, I believe, far right. And you had underscored that as an example of someone using the label far right. And I believe you felt it was appropriate for Helen to do so in that context. So also consider that in your answer as well, Brent. Are there indeed cases where labels are reasonable and appropriate, or do we still fall into that morass of labeling all people and therefore dehumanizing them?
Fun stuff. Look,
fun stuff.
Thanks for having me back.
Sure.
show your audience, I'm dressed for the occasion because I'm going to stand up for a moment. I'm wearing my dissident t-shirt about
There you go.
running barefoot on rocks, and I love it. A chance before the end of the show to tell that story, because there's significant meaning in this shirt I'm wearing. So here's the problem. Sometimes because we're in want and need of a word, we neglect a single word, we neglect thoughts and sentences. And so when we neglect a thought in a sentence and try to summarize it in a word, we absolutely savage context. And that's what we've been doing with these right-left labels. So in the book, Dissidently Speaking, we lay out the history of those terms and where they came from. And of course, they actually came from during the French Revolution, because of the way people were seated in the National Assembly, with the Friends of the Monarchy on the right and the members of what we'll call the proletariat on the left. And those seating arrangements came from traditional French table manners at the time for formal dining, where your honored guest sat to the right of the host, and the host, of course, at the head of the table, and then everyone else sat to the left. Now, so think about what we've been doing for a couple of centuries since. We've been trying to back into our descriptions of political structures because of French table manners. Now, what I just said is not my opinion. That is a fact. That is an objective fact. The terms originated from seating arrangements at a French dinner table that were translated into a National Assembly seating arrangement. And we've been trying to create a political continuum and terminology around that ever since. That ought to be enough in and of itself to get people to stop it, because the construct wasn't built around politics. The construct was built around dining, and we forced politics into it. This doesn't make any sense. Now, here's what I do when I lecture to a room of people, and I share this. This is in the book. And I just did it at the Liberty Forum of Silicon Valley a couple of months ago. So I will ask people, I'll have volunteers come up to the front of the room, and the ones that aren't participating in the moment have to step outside so they can't hear what the other person says. And I say, now I want you, for the audience, I want you to define what it means to be far right and then what it means to be far left. Here's what's fascinating. Those 3 or 4 volunteers I'll pick when they can't hear what the other one says. Do you know that none of them ever say the same thing? None of them do. And this last time I did something really fun. I gave everybody a sheet of paper, and it had 5 points along a straight line. And I said, label the point in the middle, the 2 end points, and then the 2 points that are in between the middle point and the end point. Label what those are politically. A couple hundred people in the room, no 2 people wrote the same thing down. Now, here's the problem. If I stand in front of that same room and I pick up a chair and I say, everybody all together, all at once, what am I holding up? They will say, a chair. So it's okay to label a chair. We can talk about types of chairs, but everybody agrees that a chair is a chair. And if they're not, they need some antipsychotics and a lot of help. But if we're going to use as our fundamental principled terms in our social discourse about politics 2 words that no 2 people agree on what they actually mean, that problem becomes unsolvable. And every single time we use the terms right and left, every time somebody goes on the television or radio, every time they use them in print, every time they use them in a coffee shop or a classroom, they are creating a divisive atmosphere filled with the fight or flight response, visceral responses, and no hope of having any kind of meaningful dialogue. Because at the end of all of it, what are they? They are pejoratives. They are simply terms that we use to label the other folks with whom we think we don't agree. Interesting that most people will say, look, that guy's a far left loon, but they won't say I'm a far right extremist. When somebody does call themselves right wing, it'd be very interesting because people will do this. They'll say, I'm a right wing person. Okay, great. Let's go through your series of beliefs. And then, by the way, let's find somebody else who says they're a a right wing person, a strong right winger. Okay, what are your set of beliefs on key and critical issues? What's your philosophy? What will we learn? I can tell you, it's not a guess. I've done this with enough people. You won't get the same answers. Now, right and left imply directionality. Far right and far left necessitate a knowable endpoint. You can't be far left on an infinite line. It has to end somewhere. You can't be far. So what are you far next to? And this is where no two people agree. They don't define it the same way. And what a great danger that is. Because what we do is we have a lot of folks walking around talking about chairs when maybe they're tables. And we can't get constructive when we're doing that.
So, Brent, what should Jennifer have done in her example? Because she clearly felt some visceral disaffection, if you will.
I wasn't saying that nicely. Yeah, it was. Right.
But what should she have done instead that would have been more would have been wiser, if you will, and less conducive to increased division and polarization? And that's a good question because we're all humans, right? I mean, we all have visceral reaction to things.
Well, I think that the best thing to do is to question the premises and the terms that people are using, either about themselves or others. So Jennifer, you were talking about the communist part. So let's be clear about something. We've never had a communist country in the world. None has ever existed. Now, there's been a lot of countries that have called themselves communist. And I guess they could be communist if you said, kind of like in a dictionary, where sometimes a word will have two completely different meanings. So perhaps the type of communism we've seen in the world today is definition B. But what we've never had is definition A, which is Marx's kind of communism. There's nothing that's ever happened under the name of communism if Marx is referred to which Marx would approve. So if somebody's talking about a communist, it doesn't hurt to say, what kind of communist do you actually mean? And can you define for me what a communist is? Because I want to make sure I'm talking to you on terms we can both understand. And if somebody says, well, everybody knows what a communist is, you can just politely say, well, perhaps I don't. So tell me. And then let's find out if they're using definition A or B, because we all should know Marx's definition. The form of communism we've come to refer to is a brand of totalitarianism, simple totalitarianism, where people are subjugated and private property rights are greatly eliminated to a large extent, and private property controlled by the state. So it's public property in that sense, I guess. This is nothing that Marx would have supported. There's nothing about the Soviet Union that Marx would have said, wow, this is great. I love this. So cool. This whole Gulag thing. I never thought of that. Wow, nice touch, Stalin. Way to go. So asking people when they use the term to define how they're using it, it would be very helpful. And then you might have that opportunity, especially in the case of communism, to be able to say, well, your understanding of communism and mine are a bit different. And it sounds to me like you're talking more about totalitarianism with good branding, right? Which by the way, is what Marx and communism have long been used for. I mean, if you go back to the Soviet Union and you look at what Lenin did, I know he said he was a communist. He didn't behave like one, not in the Marxist sense. And but what he did do is he took a utopic ideal and he attached it to a totalitarian movement to wrest control of government and control people with nice branding. Mao did the same thing. Castro did the same thing. That's all it is. It's the co-opting of a term for your use and redefining it. Of course, anybody who understands how the term liberal has changed over centuries is well familiar with how that can work.
I have to just jump in there, and I've got something for Wink. That it's funny because our organization is called the Institute for Liberal Values, and so people will always, in some places, it's been an obstacle, and in other places, it's been an opportunity. So some people just dismiss it out of hand. Liberal, they see it as far left, right? And then, but other people who actually ask the question, I get to have that conversation. Brent, I get to say, what is liberalism? What are the values our country was founded on? That's how we're, not redefining. That's how we're going back to the original definition of liberalism. But you just said something really interesting. It's co-opting language, and we do that all the time. And this is where, Wink, you had sent, and I'll put this in the podcast notes. You'd sent an article to Brent and I on like words that you don't use, words that you've considered slogan words that I think are normal words that have been, I would say they've been co-opted into slogan words. Can you give an example of some of those words that you just refuse to use because you see them as slogan words?
Well, sure. There in the article which Jennifer is referencing, it was on my Substack. And I think it was titled How I Became Black, because I found that to be a fascinating frame of reference. When I was growing up, in a very real sense, I became Black, quote unquote, or developed what we might call consciousness of Blackness from Black Enterprise magazine. And I think I mentioned this in our earlier podcast before. And it was curious to me to review some of those issues from the early 1970s to see what were the words that I was digesting as a sixth grader or a seventh grader or eighth grader to understand the world and understand this idea of Blackness. And the words were words that shouldn't surprise us. They were coming from Black Enterprise magazine, which trumpets the accomplishments of entrepreneurs. So self-reliance, triumph over adversity, foresight, resilience, grit, determination, quietus, a Roman virtue. Those are the sort of things I would come across in Black Enterprise as a way to understand Blackness. In the modern day and age, there are new words, and I'll mention some of them that I consider slogan words and manipulative. Take your pick. Let's see. How about marginalize? Marginalize.
I can't believe that's the one that you picked because I have questions about that one. So please.
Very good. Great minds think alike. Great minds think alike. Marginalize immediately shoehorns your perception of reality. It immediately positions you in a certain way to understand the world in a binary fashion. There must be people that are marginalized and people that are not marginalized. There must be people that are doing the marginalization and people who are suffering from the marginalization. And in fact, the real world is not like that. To paraphrase once again Alexander Solzhenitsyn, marginalization runs through the soul and heart of every person. Everyone has some dimension of marginalization and some dimension of marginalizing others. And so to me, I just really do not use that word because I see it as a word which consciously attempts to create for me a frame of reference to understand the world, to understand my consciousness, to understand the consciousness of Blackness. I much prefer other things that are more positive and more constructive, such as enterprise, such as triumph over adversity, such as resilience, such as grit, such as determination, such as pietas. I could go on and on. But Jen, jump in. That's my word so far, marginalization.
And Brent, I'd love to hear your ideas on this, but the reason I picked out marginalization out of all the words that Wink used, some of which I have no doubt are slogan words, but this is kind of funny. I'm going to make a confession here. So I was using ChatGPT to
Oh
help
no.
me. I know. That's a whole another conversation.
Confessions of Jen in the early morning.
But I was writing on a Wink. I was writing on a Black entrepreneur, and I had
Which
asked
one?
it's out today. It is it's the guy who did the first polar expedition.
Oh yeah. Henson,
Yeah.
right?
Henson.
Matthew
He
Henson?
was born today, so he's out
Oh,
today.
okay, wow.
Mhm.
Okay.
And I didn't know that much about him, so I'd asked ChatGPT to help me with this essay, and so it's really funny with ChatGPT. I've told you this, Wink, but because you and I, our writing is out there, I say do it in the voice of Jennifer Richmond, and it actually, and I've said it before, do it in the voice of Wink Twyman, and our essays come out like almost the same. It's hilarious. But
That's
one
funny.
of the things I do go back in and I use my own stuff, of course, but what comes out of there, they usually don't, they use words of resilience and triumph. But one word that they continue to use, now granted, they're looking at a time and place in Black history where I think Black Americans were truly, in the definitional sense, marginalized. And so a lot of times, like this story of Henson, right? He was the first one who made it to the North Pole. But everyone talked about, I believe the other explorer, the white explorer, was Perry, I believe was his last name.
Okay.
Perry got all the credit for it, even though Henson actually was the one who like stuck the stake in, And so, part of what came out through ChatGPT was, he made great moves towards, like demarginalizing or for marginalized society. The question is for both you and Brent. Is that word in that context? Are we misusing it?
I will take a short stab. If you're trying to write in my voice or your voice, I don't think whether you or I would have used that word. We would use different words to describe him.
And I changed
so to me, that suggests the process is corrupt from the get-go. I reject manipulation. What do you think, Brent?
Well, I'm a big believer in using words without fear as the words are properly defined. So the time to use marginalize is when something's been marginalized by definition, not by social decision. And so avoiding the use of language in that sense, I think, makes it very simple. I'm a simple man. If I think it's right to say something's been marginalized, I say it, but I don't say it because in some social context, it has some sort of meaning, which of course can then open me up to a criticism, because somebody would say, well, you use marginalized here, you see, and this is so and such and has this connotation. And, and I sort of will turn into Jesus and say, your connotation, not mine. I'm using the word as it was intended. And the surrendering of language and turning things into buzzwords, again, for want of a term, you remove the sentence, and we've lost our sentences. And then when you lose your sentences, you lose your substance. Subjects, predicates, and verbs are wonderful things. And we don't talk in sentences anymore. We talk in, Twitter destroyed a lot of communication. I know some people that actually could be quite brilliant writers. They're very good communicators, but when they write as though they're posting on X. It's you can't write that way when you're writing some sort of normal correspondence. You use your sentences. So I think the simplest thing to do with language is to use language as it's defined, without reservation, without apology, and in the right and proper context. And if someone wants to take issue with that, so be it. It's their issue, it's not yours. And we certainly don't have to bend our knee to their terminology.
Okay, so
I like that. I like that answer. Go ahead,
I want
Jen.
to stay on this for a little bit because there's a
Thank
couple
you.
words that I think have been not just co-opted. They're new. They're new, and they have new definitions that I think some people can actually, like definition A, B. I think there actually is a new definition even in Merriam-Webster. For example, and this word drives me up the wall, woke. It has no meaning to me. I mean, I just and I don't and like you said, not only does it have no meaning, and everyone has a different definition of it, like left, right. It's overused. It doesn't I mean it's a new word, if you will. And so it's more than been co-opted. I think it doesn't mean awake anymore or anything like that, like he woke up. I mean, it's got a political, a social, a cultural connotation that I think a lot of people accept. And I think that's as bad as the left right. I mean, Wink, is this one? This has become. Let's move this into the territory of slogan words because you just
Sure.
said Wink and I talk a lot about buzzwords, and I think buzzwords and slogan words overlap quite a lot. I think
I think so. Well,
go ahead.
Well, let me name my 16 words. I mean, marginalized was a great way to start, but these were the 16 words that I view as slogan words of manipulation. I just don't use them in my writing unless I'm trying to critique someone else or something else. So, for example, systemic racism, institutional racism, privilege, oppression, oppressor, oppressed, marginalized, ding, 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 intersectionality, center blackness, colonizer, Black Lives Matter, white fragility, anti-racism, diversity, equity, inclusion. So what I did, Brent, was when I looked through Black Enterprise magazine in the early 1970s, when I was a wee lad developing my sense of Blackness and Black culture, I saw none of those words. I saw none of those 16 words. So it occurred to me, what does that mean for the way in which the young kids today are understanding the world compared to how my generation would understand the world and Blackness in the early 70s? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it means that you don't know what they think and they might not either. So the wonderful thing is, so the word woke. I mean, if somebody says that somebody's woke, so we have a sense of what they mean, right? So we have this sense that what they're trying to do and say about this person is that they are overly sensitive, indeed reactionary, and almost perhaps on some level phobic and manic over particular types of thoughts or ideas or terminology, right? This is we have this sense of this. Of course, not everybody processes it that thoroughly in their brain. They just say, somebody says, "Oh, you shouldn't say it about Black people," and then they say, "Oh, you're woke," and that's it. It's that superficial, right? So if we're saying that if somebody says somebody's woke, what we ought to do is say, "What do you mean?" Well, they're woke. Okay, well, you can't define a term with the same term. Explain to me why Joe Smith is woke. What do you mean by that? Now, this is laborious and people don't want to do it because they can't be bothered because we're addicted to confrontation. And if we get to say somebody's woke, we get to hate them and dislike them, and we're done. We've satisfied the craving in our brain for conflict and off we go. But if you'd like to do better, if you'd like to get sober, like I had to do decades ago, well, then you got to say, well, what do you mean when you say they're woke? Tell me exactly what you mean, and force people to start to actually not just define to you, but really to define to themselves. I go back to the left-right thing. Everybody uses the term, and no two people have the same definitions about what they are. How does that work? How dangerous is that? Those are the prevailing two terms in American political culture, by the way. Those are the two biggies. So our two biggest terms have no universally agreed upon meaning. Can't be defined, or just defined somehow in my mind. I've got a sense of what I mean. Okay, well, that doesn't mean that the other person listening to me has the same sense, or the room in front of me does, or so on, right? So,
Well, Brent, this idea just occurred to me, and I want you to address it. In order for someone to walk down that path you've laid out, which I think is a very wise path to question terms and define your terms, doesn't it require that person to be open to living an examined life? My sense is most people who just go along with dogma and slogan words are not conditioned, they're not opened to living an examined life. They just want to live a carefree life, and it's easier to live an unexamined life and just go along your merry way. What are your thoughts about that?
yeah, it's easier to live an unexamined life. We also, another way to describe that is an empty life.
Ooh, that's deep.
An unexamined life is an empty life. And, you know, if you want to set out to prove something, you have to be just as willing to disprove it. And that means that you need to approach things with an open mind and an engagement and an inquisitiveness that is genuine and persistent. So you have to really want to do it, and you have to be willing to work at it. And you're right. I mean, it basically kind of said most people aren't willing to do that, and they aren't. You know, and they need to, as we say in the Common Ground program, you know, Felicia's slogan, they have to do better. People have to do better here, and they have to be willing to stop themselves and say, I really would like to be part of the solution to what's going on in this country instead of part of the problem, and that's going to require a little bit of commitment and a little bit of work. You know, it wasn't the easiest thing in my life I ever did to give up Jack Daniels. Trust me. But as I sit here today doing this interview with you with a couple of cans of Fresca, I feel a whole lot better, and I'm every bit as happy, right? Probably happier. So doing the work to make the commitment to change a pattern of behavior. And that's what people have to be willing to do.
I see two problems.
And no, Jen, go.
The first is, we touched on it last time. The first is, and you just touched on it now, Brent, is like things like Twitter. Or you know, earlier in this conversation, things like Twitter almost dumb us down to use these little words so that they can fit in, you know, however many characters we can have. So we're living in that kind of environment. But then the other thing, and this is a question, is do people care? I really don't know that. I mean, I think we do. I think the work that we do, you know, shows that we care. But I think some people actually like their addiction to anger. I think that they thrive on it. And so how, if we really do care about how we move forward in this world and in this country and as individuals, I mean, do we just throw out the, you know, the majority who don't care, who like the anger? You know, I mean, how do we operate in a world of people that I don't know care?
Well, we work a 12-step, and we carry the message to the addict who's still suffering. And that's sort of our obligation. And it's an obligation to try, but not to obsess. You know, I'm a quite simple person, and most of my lessons in life seem to come from television and the movies. I think I might have mentioned in our first show that I grew up on the Canadian border, a little town, Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. We were very isolated. It was very cold, 135 inches of snow a year. Snowiest city in the United States with a population of over 10,000 people. Eat your heart out, Buffalo. But anyways, we got much of how we learn the world works from going to the local single screen theater once a week or watching TV. And there was a great episode scene in an old TV show, MASH. You're both too young to remember it, but you've
Yes,
seen
I remember MASH. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So where Hawkeye Pierce, the star doctor character, had lost this young patient soldier who was shot. He had really tried, and the kid died, and Hawkeye just wasn't processing it well. And the Colonel Blake looked at him and he said, "Look, son, there's two rules in medicine. Rule number one is that patients die. And rule number two is that doctors can't change rule number one." Now, I saw that when I was probably 12 years old, and it stuck with me for 50 years. And so what we have to understand is that when we step into the public square and we attempt to engage other people and perhaps change the way that they look at things, that we aren't going to be able to save every patient. And we have to just say, okay, we don't need to, by the way. One of the critiques we'll get when we tell people about our Common Ground campus program is people say, well, why do you bother? You know, this is so widespread on our campuses and all this stuff. You can't possibly reach all these students. My answer is simple. We don't need to. There's only one Napoleon. There was only one Churchill. There was only one Washington, and so on. We need to reach some number that we can reach and hope that they reach more. Final thought on that. You know, we talk about Marxism and communism and the misuses of the term. A real true Marxist movement launched in the early 1930s in Germany, and that was the Frankfurt School. And this was a small group of intellectuals who said Marxism isn't advancing the way we hoped it would through the economic model, through materialism and that dialectic. So let's advance it culturally. And they got together and they started this school. Now, I don't think what I'm about to say is true literally, and I don't know, but I'm going to say that it's true metaphorically. And that is, that group of intellectuals started with basically a one-room schoolhouse, but they educated young intellectuals of the time who went out into universities and educated more students, who went out and educated more students. And now the most widely spread, influential school of thought in the entire country today, and there's nothing close, is what came out of the Frankfurt School. They're winning. There's all sorts of different influential movements, ideas, groups, and things. Classical liberalism still lives. But the most pervasive and the most influential is the Frankfurt School. And they started small and they got very big. So let's remember, we can't save all patients. There's nothing we can do about it. Let's remember we can engage as many people as possible. And let's remember that every time one of those engagements turns north in a positive direction, those people will engage more people. And let's pray for geometric progression.
Brent, one of my thoughts, and I may have mentioned this in our previous podcast, or maybe not, but I tend to always kind of look down the road. I'm always more concerned about the future than the present, because we're living in the present, but the future is yet to come. So we have, in a sense, the greatest impact over what the future to be may become. So my point being, I believe, just because of the nature of human psychology and generational psychology, that the kids born in the next decade, the 2030s and the 2040s, I believe that those kids will bring with them just a visceral, natural reaction to the conformity of their parents and grandparents. I mean, I can foresee a renaissance, if you will, in nonconforming thought in those ones yet unborn in the 2030s and 2040s. And I think that will usher in literally a renaissance in American thought, in American intellectual behavior as we approach 2050 and beyond. What are your thoughts on that? Is it foolhardy to try to think that far ahead in terms of ideological shifts, or is it very prescient to place our bets on, the unborn generation growing into their nonconformity in reaction to the conformity of their parents and grandparents?
Oh, look, I think it's a great question. It's a great idea. So, couple thoughts. First of all, sort of the rebellious nature of generations is, it is human nature, seemingly now, but there's a cultural influence to that nature. We went through centuries, literally centuries in the human experience, where there really wasn't much generational rebellion, right? We don't see the kinds of vast swings that took place, say in between 1250 and 1350 in you know, the area that is now France, right? There is not a bunch of history about that. Things kind of just moved along generation to generation. So why is it though that it's been so prevalent that we've seen it in more modern post-Enlightenment society in free countries? Well, I'd suggest that perhaps it is because of innovations in technology and other comforts of living and other things. There are more alternative choices. So if you walk into a convenience store and you want a soda, and you know, you've been maybe you've been on the road drinking Diet Pepsi all day, and you've kind of had enough Diet Pepsi, so you want something else. You walk into this little gas station, and all it's got is Squirt or Sprite or Mountain Dew. Well, you're likely gonna pick one of them because you're tired of drinking Pepsi. But if there had been 15 other choices in the cooler, you might have chosen one of them. So as we go through next generations and they encounter this natural, what seems to be now natural rebelliousness because of the rapidly changing architecture of society and what's available, what choices do we make available to them? What are the alternatives? So for people who love individual liberty and freedom, I would suggest that we need to get it on the shelf. If it's not in the cooler, they can't pick it. And so our task today is to fill the shelves for tomorrow.
That warrants a clap.
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
you.
That was
Very kind.
So there's one question that I want to, it's slightly tangential, but not really. You talk a lot in your book about ethics, and you talk in particular about objective ethics. How does that apply to Dissidently Speaking, and what kind of ethics do we need to adopt if we don't already have them innate in us to stock the shelf, as you said, to really build this new world that has these ideals that we're talking about throughout this conversation? Can you talk a little bit more about ethics and what we need to do about that?
Right, sure. So here's my thought with regard to ethics. To the extent I would actually want to sell an idea to somebody, you know, really, you know, the spirit of the book, and it really truly is Felissa and Mai's book, because you know, she designed the cover and gave the title, but she also inspired a lot of the content in it. And so I take some credit, but I give her a bunch too. What we're really trying to do is get people to start to think critically and ask questions. Not trying to sell much, but here's what if I could sell something, I would sell objectivist ethics, because I think it is the best ethical system, most complete ever devised. And happy to do a whole other show on it. But basically, objectivist ethics provides you with a framework where when you are encountering a very difficult choice, you have something to work through in order to make a decision that you can live with. And it is a very complete system. It doesn't allow you to do harm to others or take advantage of them. It allows you to sacrifice things only to the extent that there are things you're sacrificing that do not jeopardize your primary values. It requires a thoughtful examination of cause and effect from the decision you're about to make, so on. It's a very complete system. But there are other systems. You know, there's Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, had what was called a categorical imperative, which was, if the decision I'm about to make were a rule that all of society had to follow, could society survive, right? So that's a way to look at things. There's a problem with that system insofar as it depends on how you frame the question. So you can kind of be a bit of a moral relativist before you're even an absolutist because of how you frame the question. Would it be okay to kill this person while society couldn't survive? Would it be okay to kill this person because X, Y, Z, and only on Tuesday at 10 o'clock? Well, then that would be okay, right? And so you could get yourself through it. You could rationalize. There's utilitarian ethics, where you weigh cost and benefit of choices to the greater whole, right? That's another system. We have the Christian ethic, or do we? Christian ethics are pretty interesting. So first of all, we use Judeo-Christian as a term. We talk about Judeo-Christian ethic. That's fascinating because Jewish view of ethics and Christian view of ethics can differ greatly. Also, within the Christian community, there's a great deal of disagreement over what Jesus would do. So if you can find a consistent Christian ethic, I guess that's fine. Use it, apply it. But at the end of the day, most people know little or nothing of any of these systems. Most people will insist that they are ethical. And when you really push them on it, they can't really tell you why. But what we do is this, as people, I think, mostly. We know that if we do bad things to other people, and we do them often and overtly for our own benefit, we know that will come back to haunt us. There's a consequence. And so we know we can't be too aggressively bad about doing that. We have to behave a bit. We also know that we'd like to be liked. Most people generally would like to be liked. So we'll kind of do things in a tough situation that might lead to that outcome. So we know that we can't really hurt people too much because that'll come back to haunt us. We would like to be liked, so we'd like to do some positive things. And then everybody moves along some sort of line. Some people are able to hold to that simple little paradigm for very long, over very difficult circumstances. They've got a threshold that's pretty high. Other folks, not so much. They have what I would call the Tootsie Roll problem with ethics. And again, another old reference because I'm a simple man. There used to be this great commercial for the Tootsie Roll pop, you know, the candy pop. You can still get them, I think. And the cartoon was, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll pop? And the cartoon character would go 1, 2, and then bite through it and say, it takes 3 to get to the center. Well, of course, they cracked a bit early. And I think for many people, for most people, the question is, how long can they hold out before they do something in a difficult situation that unnecessarily, without warrant, without good cause, does damage to others? And if you want a concrete way to view all of what I just said, imagine in your own life, in your workplace or in your family or something, where someone does something and you look at someone else and you say, I can't believe what Joe just did. I never, ever expected them to do that. I never saw it coming. Well, what I just shared explains that fully. Joe was able to hold on, hold on, hold on. And throughout years of knowing Joe, you never saw any sign of that. But Joe just suddenly got pushed to a point where he said, it doesn't matter anymore if people don't like me. It doesn't matter anymore if I hurt somebody else. I'm going to do this. And then the world looks at him and says, wow, I never expected that from you. Conversely, by the way, there's other people where you say, that guy's an SOB. He does this stuff all the time, right? He's got a really, really small window. He can't even get to the third lick on the Tootsie Roll Pop.
I have a question. You mentioned Judeo-Christian ethics, and given my upbringing, my childhood, it occurred to me, and this might be a simplistic observation, if everyone, or let's say over 95% of people, were to subscribe to just a simple rule for simple people, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, wouldn't that in a sense usher in the blessed society where divisions and polarizations and hatred and wars and troubles dissipate away, because you would act always as you would want someone to act towards you? What do you think about that?
I reference the notion in the book, in the chapter that's dedicated to talking about this addiction to confrontation. And look, I think that's at the heart and soul of the best of the Christian ethic. And if you take a look at when the Pharisees were trying to trick Jesus and get him to sort of misstep on scripture, and they say, Rabbi, what's the greatest of the commandments, right? And we all know the answer. And the first one is, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. Well, let's pretend you're an atheist and you don't like that. Okay, let's swipe left, but let's go to the next one, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. And so if you focus there, and if you can start there, now there's a lot of intricacies to be built around it about how that actually turns into a decision. But the foundation of it is a wonderful foundation. I have no objection to it as a principle, as a guiding light. I wish that more people that profess their Christianity practice that rule. I've come to a sad conclusion, by the way, that I'll share with your audience. The louder the public pronouncement of one's Christianity, the less the private exhibition of it. I think that the louder people get in the public square about just how Christian and faithful they are, the less you can expect from them in their private lives. It's as though they're trying to offset their own behavior. And I say that sadly, based on a lot of anecdotal evidence over many years of watching behavior. Some of the people that are most outspoken about what Jesus would do, when you turn around and you get involved with them in their private lives, maybe they ought to play back their own public speech.
I just
I agree with you. Just one counterpoint. Someone my mother adored throughout my childhood, Reverend Billy Graham. I suspect that Reverend Billy Graham was probably someone who indeed had a public face and a private face that were relatively consistent and harmonious. He might just be an exception to the rule, however.
One needs exceptions to rules to have those rules. And
I just finished reading Tim Keller's Prodigal God, and one of the things that he says, and you just kind of touched on this, or it brought this to mind, was ideology has become idolatry in a lot of and I thought that was brilliant. And when I see public figures using their faith, in these kind of ideological ways, it drives me up the wall. I mean, in terms of ethics, it's funny that you said, I think about this kind of a lot. Like my ethics it is not based on a particular denomination or a particular church. It is, what would Jesus do? And I probably get it wrong all the time. I know I get it wrong all the time, but let me go back to objective ethics. If you could boil it down to something that's digestible so we can understand what is objective ethics vis-a-vis the golden rule, vis-a-vis what would Jesus do, how would you define it?
Sure. Objectivist ethics can get boiled down very, very easily because it starts and has foundational, very, very famous line that Ayn Rand wrote in the book Atlas Shrugged. And that is, I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine. And so this is attacking the notion at once of mindless, blind self-sacrifice versus at the same time insisting that no person ever do that for you as well. So I am not going to surrender my existence for your sake, and I am not going to ask you or allow you to do that for me. You'd be surprised, and there's more to objectivist ethics than that, but you'd be surprised at adopting just that part of it, what that can do in terms of affecting your behavior. Because how often do people ask you to do something that wants you to make some sort of sacrifice, take a risk for their benefit? You can make an argument that anytime somebody tailgates you on the road, when you're driving at least the speed limit or slightly above, that is actually purely unethical. And this is an odd thing. It seems so silly, but I'm sort of silly as a person. What are they asking you to do when they tailgate you when the speed limit's 55 and you're going 58? They are asking you to go faster, to break the law more, to take the risk of a ticket. Why? Because they want to go faster. In its simplest, it seems like a silly construct, but it's just that simple. I can't ask you to do something where when you do it, you're going to take some risk on my behalf. I can't ask you to do that for my sake. If people could just remember that one little thing, just that piece, that could make an extraordinary improvement in human behavior. I will never do that. I will never ask somebody to do something, to take some sort of risk on my behalf. I won't do it. I can't do it. I'm limited by my system. And that's of great value to me. And because we're all tempted to do it. It's an easy thing to be tempted to do.
I'm still going to tailgate if you're going too slow.
So
Brent,
that is between you and your God. There.
What would Jesus do? Well, I don't know.
Right. So Brent, it sounds like you would take exception to a great American philosopher, Malcolm X, who once said, "By any means necessary," as a life philosophy. It sounds like you would take exception to that.
Oh, sure.
By any means necessary.
That's just English translation of Machiavelli, who gave us the line, "The ends justify the means."
Yes.
No, they don't. They simply don't. And that is the purest of moral relativist positions. And we have far too many Machiavellians. Machiavelli was right about a great many things. It's not like, I don't throw any philosopher or thinker out completely. None of them. I think that all of them were right about something. All of them were the product of the times in which they lived and the life that they had lived in those times, right? So all of them have something worthwhile. But this ends justify the means mentality, this mentality that runs throughout the mafia, for example.
Yes.
Great mafia leader who is jailed, and now he's a big public speaker. He's been a successful businessman, but he was a mob enforcer, and he wrote a book, and he said it was interesting that in the mob, when you got to be a made man, they gave you a copy of The Prince to read. You read Machiavelli.
Mm.
And he said, and then when we wind up in jail, we all read Solomon. And so there's sort of there's a little beauty to that. I like that. But
Right.
yeah, no, we can't go through life believing that the ends justify the means. To a large extent, the problems that we have in America today are a byproduct of that simple sentence.
Yeah. This is fascinating.
Brent,
Fascinating.
I want to end with a story. Your story. You at the very beginning, you showed us your shirt. My
Yes.
last question is, what does it mean to be a dissident? And I feel like what you have on your shirt is part of that story and that answer. So, what does it mean to be a dissident, and what does your shirt mean to you?
Yes, that's fun. So I'm going to stand up again so your audience can see the shirt.
All right, it says,
So
it says, join the fight, run barefoot on rocks.
Right. So one of the great things about life is that if you go through it in a way that you're observing what's taking place and paying attention, moments can become metaphors. And so in July of 2021, I had the chance to speak at a conference that was in South Dakota at the Sturgis campground site. It was organized well in advance. It was heavily suppressed on social media for reasons that on some level are still a mystery to this day. There was nothing about it that was antagonistic in its presentation. It talked about fireworks, it talked about patriotism, it used the flag and those kinds of images. And yet, suppressed heavily on social media. Some of the people that had agreed to speak and participate backed out because they said this is kind of strange. And then it impacted attendance, of course, and registration because it wasn't being able to be promoted. But nonetheless, people showed up, and I was there, and I was supposed to be one of the featured speakers on Saturday night. Well, not only was the event sabotaged ahead of time, but actually at the campground itself, what we came to discover is that the people that ran the campground and the people that worked there were turning people away. People would call and they'd say, oh, the park is full. No, you can't, there's no more admission, you can't get in. And there were things going on at the gate, it turns out. And this is where the heart of the story lies. So on Friday afternoon of the event, there's a little watering hole at this campground, and there was going to be a little fun activities for everybody in attendance, some games and other stuff, right? And in the very front of that, the Sturgis campground, graveled driveway, and that's where the gate is. There was also a guest house up there where the folks that were running the event were staying as a unit. And one of those folks was the gal who I've talked about, who's become my dear friend and partner, Felissa Blazek. She had organized the event. And so Felissa was coming out of her, the home to go to the event, no shoes, bare feet, but, sandals in hand. And there's a car that was at the gate, and it was swinging away from the gate, window was down, and she could see the woman driving the car with a family in it, like she had tears in her eyes. And so she tears off after the car, screaming at it to stop. And the car stops, and so what's the problem? And the lady said, well, we drove here all the way from Iowa with my family, and we were going to go to the event, but the fellow at the gate just said we didn't have the right passes and we can't get in. So she reaches into her pocket and she pulls out a handful of badges and throws it to her. And she said, of course she can get in. And she goes up to the security guard and gives him a piece of her mind, and then goes in to find out what the hell is going on at the office. And later that night, when we were sitting around talking, in the process of doing that, she had torn her feet to pieces and could barely walk. And somebody, when she's telling the story, somebody said, why did you do that? Why did you do what you did? Her answer was so simple and so beautiful. It was, what was I supposed to do? They were patriots. Somebody had to do something. And so there it is. We have allowed our country to sink to the point where we are on the edge of, you can call it what you want, it's totalitarianism. We have been such poor parents and so neglectful of the liberty and freedom that our founding fathers gave to us that we're on the brink of losing it. And if we think that we're going to be able to get it back without paying a price, without feeling some pain, without taking some risk, we are mistaken. So all of us need to be willing to take off our shoes and run barefoot across the rocks and do what we have to do to try to reverse the course of this country. So that's the shirt. That was the moment that became a metaphor to me that was so powerful that stayed with me ever since.
Wow, that's a great story. That'll stay with me for a bit.
Yeah. Well, Wink, I
That
think that
image.
our band of dissidents that we know, our own band of dissidents, have just grown
Right.
by at least one.
Yes.
Well, that's great. In the story, when I tell it, if you're great on picking up on nonverbals, you could tell that when I tell that story, it chokes me up. I get emotional because, first of all, I was there and I remember the moment. But when I use the words to tell the story, I feel the story. Do I have 2 minutes to add a footnote to that?
Uh-huh.
So only a week after that event, I was at the Liberty Forum in Silicon Valley to speak for what was the first time. And I talked about the dissident essay I wrote that's included in this book in an updated version. And I told the story at the very end. And of course, when you speak somewhere publicly, people line up afterwards to come and talk to you. So a gentleman comes up to me, he's first in line. And I had noticed he like jumped up when the thing ended. He was in the middle of a row in the middle of the room. And he got up first in line and he had an accent. And he said, Brent, he said, my name is Peter Hamachek. And I was a real life dissident in Czechoslovakia. I was there when the Soviet tanks rolled into Prague in '68. And he said, everybody in the world needs to hear the speech you just gave. He said, but the story you told at the end, he said, that brought tears to my eyes. He said, because it brought it all back. So that's the power of the metaphor, right? This was a guy who was involved in facing Soviet tanks. He hears a story about a gal in South Dakota running on gravel. And what does it do? It evokes the emotion and the memory, and it shows you the fight's bigger, right? But embrace the spirit.
I love that. Thank you, Brent.
Thank you.
In recognition of Banned Books Week, September 22nd through the 28th this year, we are launching our inaugural book club with James LaRue's On Censorship, a public librarian examines cancel culture in the U.S. Join us for a live meeting with the author on Wednesday, October 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. In preparation for that live stream, read along with our ILV advisors who will discuss the book in 4 brief special episodes of the Dissidents podcast. They will be released on Wednesdays from September 4th through September 25th. On censorship, James LaRue issues a balanced and reasonable call to action for all citizens. It is a combination of personal reflection and a deep dive into the specifics of book banning. James LaRue has been a public library director for many years and was director of the Freedom to Read Foundation, the ALA, American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom. He has written, spoken, and consulted extensively on intellectual freedom issues, leadership, and organizational development. He's engaged in community work and is invested in the future of libraries. This year, the theme of Banned Books Week is Freed Between the Lines. The annual event is a reminder of that the freedom to read is a liberal value worth defending. Learn more about banned books by checking out the American Library Association's website, ala.org.